All right, so I will start here just by trying to briefly summarize the basic categories of the idea of truth, the definition of truth, the ways in which we look at it. The one that's most familiar to everybody, I think, and probably the one that people most take for granted, is what's known as the correspondence theory of truth. This we find in Plato in the Ideas. The idea is actually an idea of the object. In fact, to some degree, the object is the imitation of the idea. The idea is what is real, and the thing that we encounter in the world is simply the image of it. We have it in Aristotle in the same way. Aquinas, translating Aristotle, calls truth the correspondence of the intellect and the thing. And this has been the guiding definition of truth through most of Western philosophy, through the Middle Ages, through Aquinas, all the more particularly through the Enlightenment. Of course, the question comes up, how can the idea in my head really match up to whatever it is supposed to be an idea of? And there are huge arguments about that. The correspondence theory of truth is also called sometimes the representational theory of truth, because it presumes that truth is somehow in my head, and that what I'm doing is I'm taking some real thing encountered in the world. There is an externally existing reality of some sort, and I'm representing it in the form of reason in my head in some way. Now, you'll see as we go through that this doesn't exactly fit the way any of the thinkers really look at it, but it's what's taken for granted in a lot of ways. There's another theory of truth called the coherence theory. And what this says is it doesn't really matter if what I claim is true has any correspondence to an external reality. The standard for what is true is entirely a question of how what I say about something fits into a coherent whole with a system of thinking about it. So any statement that I make has to be consistent and coherent with a set of other statements. You can think about Euclidean geometry and non-Euclidean geometry in this respect. Anything that I can say about geometry in the sense that we all learned it in grade school and high school, Euclidean geometry, is true so long as I am also saying that two parallel lines extended infinitely in space never meet. But since I can't prove that, I don't know that that necessarily corresponds to any reality. I can say, suppose two parallel lines extended infinitely in space eventually intersect. And I can build an entire alternative geometrical system on that, which is itself coherent, consistent, not in contradiction with itself, and which actually gets used in science to provide us with a lot of useful insights and ways of going about things. So that's another way of looking at the truth. It doesn't really matter what the reality is. What matters is the coherent system itself. Another system of truth, or another way of looking at truth that no doubt everyone is familiar with, is the social construction of truth. Anyone who's read Plato is certainly familiar with that. Anyone who's read Nietzsche has some ideas about that. The claim that there is not any truth per se, but we agree to call truth whatever the community sets up as a system of designating, this and not that. We say as a community that this is true, and truth is about adhering to that communal system. When I violate it, I'm deceiving someone, I'm manipulating someone. When I stick with the communal norms about what truth is supposed to be, then I'm honest and truthful within that system. And then there's one other that I want to touch on, which is somewhat related to the last, but a bit different, which is relativism. Relativism claims that there is no truth that is valid universally across the board. We each have our own separately, subjectively valid experience of truth, and we don't have a way of necessarily reconciling these with somebody else's experience. So, in a certain way, you can say relativism makes the concept of truth irrelevant, throws it out the window. In another sense, it locates it very much simply in an extreme of individual perspective. Again, even though it may look in some places like we are approaching a kind of relativism, I don't think any of the thinkers that I'm bringing up today, including Nietzsche, is actually a relativist. So, one other aspect that gets touched on in terms of overview about truth. Part of the question of truth is, what on earth does truth have to do with? Why do we ask the question? In one sense, truth is a question about the nature of the real world. Is there something that we call reality which is outside us, which we're all obligated to deal with? Or is there, in a sense, no real world, no common world, no shared world? How do we know what reality is and what it's not? Is there a reality that we don't really have access to? Or what are the criteria for knowing that we've gotten in touch with something real as opposed to something subjective or made up? In this context, very related to it, the discussion about truth almost always is tied to a discussion about transcendence or God. Beginning with Plato, the ideas exist in the mind of God in a certain sense. The ideas are divine. They don't belong to me. They're not in my head. They are an ability to participate in what is eternal and divine in some sense. And so the whole discussion of truth, and remember that Socrates was tried for impiety, the whole discussion of truth plays out in a certain respect in relation to a discussion of divinity or piety. Now, in every case, this is not traditional revealed religion, divinity or piety. It's the God of the philosophers, however that be understood. But there's some sense of something beyond us. Truth is about, in most of these discussions at least, recognizing something that is bigger than me, that obligates me. Recognizing something outside of myself that I owe something to. And in that sense, looking at something that's transcendent, looking at something that lays down a kind of law for me in a certain kind of way. Truth is at home in the fields of rationality and science, logic and science, of course, now. And in the history that I'm going to talk about, the development of truth gets more and more narrowly defined as logical and more narrowly defined as scientific. We have a tendency in the modern world, I think, to accept scientific truth. At least most of us do if we have an education. We believe that science has access to something that we call truth, that we can reason about this, that there are grounds for, there are ways of arguing and things that constitute evidence and ways of proving things. And that when we call something true, we're talking about something that it can be reasoned about and can be proven in some real way. Science becomes the paramount standard of truth because, after all, science works. It gets hard to dispute with science when it actually gives us control over nature. And so science has a status in terms of helping, or in terms of setting the standard for what counts as true in the world that nothing else quite has, at least anymore. Especially separate from belief, from fiction, from faith, from any of those things. There's another realm, though, in which truth and the discussion of truth has always been especially relevant. And that's actually the realm of human relationship and ethics, which is very much not the realm of science. And, repeatedly over the years, I find in class that a lot of people are willing to say, yes, there is a truth about the world, about science, about objects in the world, about mathematics, No, there's not a truth about what's good for human beings. Doesn't exist. We're dealing with apples and oranges here, people will say. And that is, in a certain way, natural result of some of the way the idea of truth has developed, and in a certain way, a real question. Or at least something that we ought to question, because one of the opposites to truth is lie. One of the ways in which we use truth has to do with being honest, with telling the truth rather than deceiving people, with the sense that we have an obligation to other people. One of the things that I want to do as I go through this history is take a look at how each of these thinkers touches upon each of these different areas that truth has a relationship in, and what they do with that. All right, let's start with Plato and Socrates. Most of you are probably familiar with the Platonic conception of the ideas. The correspondence idea of truth, the idea that truth is a correspondence between the idea, the rational idea, and the object that is outside, is it has its basis in the Socratic doctrine of the ideas. That's its real starting point, and it's in that sense, in part, that Socrates is considered to be the founder of Western philosophy. It's partly how he talks about truth and the role of reason in truth. Plato develops this notion of the reality, the genuine reality of the world being something which is rational, is comprehensible, is in the form of an idea that we don't have, but we have to try to find. The things in the world, the experiences in the world, the objects in the world are appearances, and they can deceive us all the time. But we need to try to apply a standard of reasoning, apply a standard of evidence to get closer and closer to what the real thing is, which is something which would be perfectly intelligible. The real model for this in Plato, for Socrates, in the way he develops it in numerous dialogues really, is mathematics. The paramount truth is mathematical truth. And, it's not surprising that as this idea develops in the course of Western history, we have Einstein saying that the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics. We're dealing with that as the primary concept of truth here. Truth also gets talked about in terms of its relationship to opinion for Plato. If we know something, as opposed to if we merely opine it, then what that means is that we are able to give a logical, a rational account of it. We're able to give reasons. We're able to tie it completely down adequately from all directions with reasoned arguments. Truth there becomes, and the model for that is, in fact, Euclidean geometric proof. Again, going to mathematics. Finding the truth of something is, in a certain sense, proving it, or giving as close to a proof of it according to reason and evidence that we can get. And that fits with the way truth is used in modern science as well. But the more interesting part of Plato, to me, the more interesting part of Socrates, is what he does besides this, because that's not his whole idea of truth. In the Meno, the dialogue Meno, he is trying to convince a young man, a very talented but very immoral young man, that it's worthwhile to try and find the truth. Meno challenges the idea that truth even exists or that we could find it if it did. And Socrates makes a claim. He can't prove to Meno that there is such a thing as truth. It's not possible to prove that there is such a thing as truth. But what he does is he gives a mythical description of how it is that we have access to truth already in us that connects to the world. And then he says that he believes this. He believes this. It's a statement of faith on his part. He will fight for it in word and in deed. As long as he lives, he will fight for that belief. And that the reason for this is that we're better and our lives are better if we believe it than if we don't. Now, that puts truth in a little bit of a different context. We don't know if there's such a thing as truth, but if we want to have a decent life, we're better off to just assume that there's such a thing as truth, and then spend our lives looking for it, by the way. We have to do that because the alternative is a life of argumentation, a life of violence, a life of what Hobbes will later call the war of all against all. Looking for truth gives us a kind of moral compass and a way of relating to people around us, a way of building communities that gets us out of the problem of violence. Now that's an important context for Socrates, I think, and it's one that it's easy to gloss over because it's not one that's always made a lot of in later thinking. There's another context to the way in which Socrates discusses truth. And this comes from the Phaedrus, in part. In the Phaedrus, Socrates is talking about the difference between speech and writing, and why it is that there's a problem with trying to write the truth down. Socrates focuses there on the difference between the idea in the sense of the divine idea and the concept in the sense of the word. There's a huge gap between those things. So when I use a word, I know what I mean by it, and I might have a good sense of what it means, and I might not. But when I use a word speaking to you, you don't know necessarily what I mean by it. You know what you mean by it. And the only way, and in that sense, every word conveys something that is true and something that is untrue. It always has to be interpreted. It always is potentially misleading. Truth can't then be expressed in words, at least in the sense of what he calls dead words, written words. Truth instead only comes out in conversation, in living conversation, because in order for us to come to any kind of understanding of what we're saying to each other, we have to question each other. We have to try and understand what each other means and where we're coming from and try to come to some common ground on that basis. And if we can't do that, we can't get to truth. Truth is something then that, in a real sense, exists only in actual dialogue between actual human beings. It doesn't exist out in any kind of abstract place. It doesn't exist in philosophical treatises. It doesn't exist in proofs in a certain sense. Where it really exists is in conversation between limited human beings trying to clear up some confusions. Now that ties to what Socrates says in the Apology, which is that, of course, he is the wisest man of all because he is the only one who knows that he doesn't know. And the thing that ties with that, the statement, the bald-faced statement, human wisdom is worth little or nothing. Surprising thing from a man who calls himself a lover of wisdom and who devotes his life to trying to find it. But it's an important caveat. If we take these things together, what we have is a vision of truth that is something that is outside of us and beyond us in a certain way, something that obligates us, something that we have to look for, but at the same time something that we can never have a hold of. The surest sign for Socrates that someone doesn't know what they're talking about is that they think they do. And the first thing that makes somebody politically dangerous is that they think they know the truth. So this is a very important. It's a very important context for putting the theory of ideas and the correspondence theory of truth into. This is a sense in which the Platonic conception of truth, or the Socratic conception of truth, still is part of a world that is tragic. It's part of a world that we don't completely control and that we don't completely understand, and that if we're smart, we'll know that we never can completely control and never can completely understand. So there's a sense of respect for the world, respect for other human beings, and a struggle to find peaceful ways of working out truth within that in a limited way in a human lifetime. Now that, of course, changes over the course of the history of truth. But what I'm going to do at this point is jump to Nietzsche. So, jumping over quite a lot of history in between, I want to take up Nietzsche's understanding of truth. Nietzsche has, a real radicalization of the word truth, the meaning of truth, what we're doing with truth. And I want to start with a brief treatment of an essay that you might know, you might not know. It's called On Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense. It's a wonderful piece. It's not very often included in collections of Nietzsche, but it's easy to find on the internet. So either in German or in English, in several translations. So I highly recommend it. It's fabulous. He wrote this the year after the birth of tragedy. And it does some very important things. In Truth and Lies in a non-moral sense, Nietzsche talks about truth as a fable in the following sense. He describes the world as, the world that we see, the reality of the world, as infinitely varied, infinitely individual, always changing. In a sense, it's chaotic, it's manifold. There's no such thing as a tree in the real world. What there is in the real world is an infinite number of individual variations on what we come to call tree later. And unlike Socrates, Nietzsche doesn't say tree is real and the actual living things that are infinitely different are just images of that. Nietzsche says, no, those things outside that we see and we touch, they're the real things. What's not real is the idea, the concept that we form of it. Now, Nietzsche was a philologist. He worked with language, and he talks about the basis of language being metaphor. We construct a language based on, identifying things conceptually, not because it's the way they are, but because it's a useful metaphor. This is kind of like that. We abstract certain qualities out, we get rid of other qualities, we put things together that belong together in some ways, but not in other ways, and we create a package purely because it's useful to us. He calls He calls truth in this sense, it's a movable host of metaphors, metonymies, and anthropomorphisms. It is a sum of human relations which have been poetically and rhetorically intensified and transferred and embellished, and which after long usage seem to a people to be fixed, canonical, and binding. Truths are illusions which we have forgotten are illusions. They have metaphors that have been worn out and have been drained of sensuous force. They're coins that have lost their embossing and are now considered as metal and not just as coins. Now, this is very important for understanding what Nietzsche says about truth. We create these metaphors because we have to. It doesn't, we don't function well in a chaotic world. But the world is chaotic. And so we construct a non-chaotic world for ourselves We build it. The standard, then, of truth, or the thing that the truth occurs in the context here of something that's good for human life. Truth, this ties to where Nietzsche elsewhere says truth is a useful fiction or a necessary fiction. Truth is something that's advantageous to us. It's not something that corresponds to reality in any way. There's another famous statement of Nietzsche's that then bounces back on this. The truth is that there is no truth. Most of you, no doubt, have heard that. So, of course, this is paradoxical. What he is saying here is truth as it's traditionally understood, truth as an adequate grasp of a permanent underlying reality, some unchanging world that is real, doesn't exist. There is no such unchanging reality. There is no such world that is universally true and valid. And we can't get to it. And even if there were, we couldn't get to it. But it doesn't exist, basically. So truth in the traditional sense of a correspondence to a fundamental unchanging reality that we can prove is one of these useful fictions. And if we're forced to be honest with ourselves, then we have to say, truth, the demand for truth itself requires us to say there is no truth. It requires us to give up on the notion of truth in that sense. But since we have to live in an organized world, we can't live in chaos. We need meaning. We need there to be value. We can't completely give up on it. So we have to do something different with truth. The truth is that there is no truth is also connects with the concept that God is dead, or the announcement that God is dead. God as ultimate reality, as eternal, as unchanging, as transcendent, is another human fiction that we no longer are able to believe in once we look hard enough at the underlying reality, where we find only chaos, only meaninglessness. So the challenge then for Nietzsche becomes, how do you, as a creature who needs meaning, who needs structure, how do you live in a world where God is dead? How do you live in a world, how do you live with a demand for truth when there is no truth? Another aspect of this is that every experience of the world for Nietzsche involves perspective. The whole concept of a universal truth or an objective truth implies, the concept of objectivity implies that we can somehow see things without bringing any of ourselves to what we're seeing. We can see things without any perspective. And he says there's no magical place where we can stand to do that. Every experience of the world is concrete, it's partial, it's a perspective, it's an interpretation. So there's no truth as well in that sense. One final statement of Nietzsche's that adds to this understanding of truth. Truth is a woman, and like a woman, she always loves only a warrior. Now, what on earth is he doing by saying something like this? Here, he's going back to this idea that what truth does for us is it enables us to live better. It's a fiction that enables us to love life and to be vital and to throw ourselves into life. Truth, then, is fundamentally not at its basis something rational. Truth is something that we want. Truth is something we desire. Truth is something that we have to seduce in a certain sense. Or it has to seduce us. We have to come to a view of the world that is seductive to us, that really grabs us and engages us and makes us desire it, so that we can believe it, and it can give us some sense of meaning and some sense of standing in the chaotic world. Now, Nietzsche's concept of truth, I said, is not relativism. So let me clarify why not. There is a standard of truth for Nietzsche. You can't take anything that someone asserts or anything that someone believes and say one opinion is as good as another or one assertion is as good as another. There may be no ultimate reality that any of them correspond to. It doesn't mean they're all equal. What truth becomes for Nietzsche is a construction. Truth is creating yourself. Truth is creating a world around you that is meaningful, coherent, beautiful. It's a work of art that is beautiful and inspiring. And so Nietzsche falls back on, in a sense, an understanding of truth as coherent. We're looking for a way to self-consciously understand that although we're living in a meaningless world, although we're living in a chaotic world, we can nevertheless create meaning out of it and do it well and do it in a way that is both coherent, reasonable, and beautiful. And so the truths that have validity are those, as opposed to things that are contradictory, they're fragmentary, they are uninspiring. There's a difference in that sense between truth and mere opinion, or between something that has force as truth and something that's not. Nietzsche ultimately develops the argument based on an understanding of the demands of scientific theory and the demands of reason for coherence, develops the argument that ultimate reality is nothing but will to power. When we look at things, we don't find anything in a certain sense. We don't find minds, we don't find souls, we don't find atoms, we don't find matter. He goes through at great length in a number of places, debunking the idea that anything exists, anything that we normally take as the basis of Western metaphysics. None of it's real. The only thing that we have a direct experience of and we can't deny, he said, it's not like it was for Descartes, I think, therefore I am. He says, that's full of assumptions. We're assuming that there's an I that thinks and that there's only one I and that the I thinks. But he goes on to say, who has the power to call thoughts to come when they want them to? Thoughts come when they want to come. I think, therefore I am, he thinks, is full of holes. What's not full of holes is that we all have an experience of willing or desiring. We have an experience of acting in the world and choosing to act in the world. And so the only ultimate reality that he can come up to is will, power or force, understood fundamentally as will. So he defines the nature of reality as nothing but will, which is always trying to go beyond itself. This leads him to develop an understanding of, what does this mean for human beings? What does truth as will to power mean for human beings? What does the nature of the world as will to power mean for human beings? It means that human beings turn themselves into gods. It means that we create the meaning and the transcendence and the order that aren't there to start with. And it means that we do so consciously, knowing that we're doing it. We satisfy our own needs. We have this, we do Genesis. We have the original chaos and we turn it into meaningful order, and then we call it good. And the calling it good is an important part of this, because Nietzsche says ultimately what we're looking for is meaning. We're looking for value. We're looking for a reason to continue living when there's frustration and there's suffering and it's a constant struggle. And so we have to find a way of shaping our lives and a way of understanding the world that would enable us to always say, this is wonderful, no matter what. In the middle of the worst circumstances, it's still wonderful. His way of doing this is through this idea of the eternal return of the same. which he puts forward as a kind of fictional truth. Suppose a God were to come to you and say to you, this moment that you're living now, in every detail of it, every aspect of it, you're going to be doomed to repeat forever. You will live this moment over and over again, and every other moment of your life, in every detail, over and over again for all eternity. And he asks the question, would you curse? Would you want to kill yourself? Or would you say, wow, you're a God. This is the most wonderful thing I've ever heard. What he is suggesting in the idea of the eternal return is the creation of an interpretation of the world that ultimately, the challenge is to suggest something that gives us a reason to live. The challenge, when you understand it from the perspective of the eternal return, is to make every instant of your life something that justifies every other. Something that is valuable in and of itself, infinitely valuable even. And so truth for Nietzsche ultimately falls into a kind of an ethical realm. Ethics might be the wrong word to use there for it, but it's a question of the good. It's a question of value, what we judge as good. We look for truth and we create a truth to fill our need for something that is good. Now that's certainly very different from a scientific notion of truth. I have to say, in connection with Plato, Nietzsche doesn't abandon reason. He's not throwing reason out the window. Reason is internally coherent and therefore it's useful and valid, so long as we remember that it doesn't apply to reality and it's not the whole thing. So we have reason. We also have a world that is always changing. Reality is always changing. So if we're going to be true to the nature of reality, we have to understand that it's always changing. So truth, besides not being general, truth is always my truth. It's always particular truth. It's always something that is going to change, and maybe even moment to moment, but certainly from lifetime to lifetime. There's room for many truths. Many kinds of interpretations can work and be valuable, the way there's room for many works of art. Now I want to move from there to Heidegger's concept of truth. Heidegger spends some time talking about the history of truth, the history of the concept of truth and how it develops. And he sees Plato and Aristotle, and the Greeks broadly, but particularly Plato and Aristotle, as the beginning of the history of truth in the philosophy of the West, and Nietzsche as the end of it. And in between, there is a series of transformations that take truth in one direction when it could have gone in another direction. One of the things that matters to him here is that he doesn't like, of course, where we end up. And he was deeply engaged with Nietzsche and feels like what Nietzsche leaves us with is a challenge to overcome Nietzsche. And in a certain sense, that's true to Nietzsche. But, if we go through the history of truth, we're left with something that really is a kind of nihilistic vision, although it's a beautifully done nihilism. It's a nihilism. And Heidegger is very uncomfortable with that. And he doesn't think that that's the right place to be left. So Heidegger's understanding of what truth is for the Greeks, he goes back and he does this by looking at words. He does this etymologically. The Greek word for truth is aletheia. You may recognize the term lethe, forgetfulness, oblivion in there. Truth is what is the opposite of that? Truth is then its disclosedness. It's something that gets unforgotten or unconcealed or comes to our notice out of some hiddenness. And the opposite of truth in the Greek world, he says, is not, like it is later, it's not the true and the false. It's the word pseudos, where we get our word pseudo from. Pseudo is something that dissembles. It's there in front of us, but it pretends to be something that it's not. So it's the trickiness of appearances. So what we're dealing with in the Greek world for Heidegger is struggling with the fact that the world shows itself to us, but it shows itself to us in tricky ways, in deceptive ways, and we have to engage it and wrestle with it to try to sort out, to try and pull it into the light when it's constantly wanting to slip away from us into the darkness. This truth, he says, is located in nature. Truth is about the world, or the natural world, nature itself, showing itself to us. It reveals itself. It discloses itself. Truth isn't something that we have in our head. Truth is something that we have to be open to. It's something that we look for and are open to, but we don't own it. We don't create it, and we don't own it. The next stage in truth, or the important shift in truth, comes with the translation of truth from the Greeks to the Romans, where he says truth is no longer this disclosedness or unconcealedness. Truth gets translated by the Roman word veritas. Now, what on earth does veritas mean? He looks at this etymologically and he says veritas comes from fundamentally a word which means it has to do with defense. It has to do with resistances, with gates and fences. And so veritas comes to be the thing that defends itself, the thing that stands up and is secure and constant and upright and can command us because it is secure and constant and upright. And the opposite gets translated not as this thing that conceals itself and dissembles, but as the false. It's something that has fallen down or fallen away. It's something that's easily knocked over or overcome. Thank you. What Heidegger wants to point us to in this is what he says, the Roman understanding of the world is fundamentally an imperial understanding, he argues. And they filter the concept of truth through the experience of empire. So truth comes to be understood as this ultimate ruling correctness that allows us, in a certain sense, to control the world, to command the world. Truth turns into not some struggle to see what we can't quite see, but it turns into a struggle to master the world and conquer it. This, then, he argues, gets taken one step further in the Christian interpretation, which he considers just an extension of the Roman Empire into a different realm. Truth becomes, in Christianity, the correctness of reason and will. It becomes justification before God, which then translates itself into, how is it, if we are true, if our reason, if our thinking is correct, if our wills are brought correctly into line with God, then we are justified before God, and then we are certain of salvation. And that's the important move for him there. We're concerned with truth because we want to be secured of salvation. We want to be certain that nothing can happen to us. We can't die. We can't be lost. We can't suffer. It's another aspect of control, but pushed in a different direction. And this certainty, this search for a kind of certainty and security, then is what feeds into Descartes, he thinks, going down to the next step. Descartes sets about purifying the concept of truth from religious dogmatism. We're throwing out religious dogmatism. We're going to look for the correct use of reason. And the judgment, the standard that is going to enable us to determine whether or not we really have used our reason correctly and gotten to a correct representation of reality is it certain? How certain can we be? So truth becomes certainty. And Descartes sets about trying to establish knowledge on a solid foundation of certainty. He does this by starting with things that he claims can't be doubted. The human mind, in particular, as something that thinks can't be doubted, according to Descartes. And then applying a method of correct reasoning. He's concerned with the method of reasoning. This is where we start to move into truth as logic, the logical character of truth. Reasoning and proof. which, starting from a secure foundation, reasoning according to a correct method, will give us a system of secure and certain knowledge. And in this, the reason for this system of certain and secure knowledge is that it gives us power over the world. In the Discourse on Method, he talks about it being built up as if we were building a house, a structure. And he goes so far as to say, ultimately, if we take this to its logical end, we can get bodies as incorruptible as diamonds. We will conquer not only nature, but death itself. We will, in a certain sense, make ourselves into gods, but differently. So, as far as religion creeps back into Descartes, it's a use of God as a kind of necessary term to mediate between what's in my reason and what's in the outer world. It mediates between mind and body. The divine isn't there anything that is an object of reverence or mysterious. The divine is something that we can grasp hold on. We can know that it exists. It has a role in rational proof. And it guarantees our hold on the world. It guarantees our conquest of the world. It's in the service of science, ultimately. Now, Heidegger, looking at this, says the history of truth in Western philosophy is nothing but the triumph of the ego. We change from a truth that starts in a sense of wonder at the self-disclosure of a world around us and are wrestling with that, trying to not be deceived, trying to see truly. And in doing that, we're looking for getting out of ourselves so that we're true to what's really out there. We're not bringing ourselves to the object, but we're opening up to the object the way it really is out there. That transforms in the course of this history to saying what's true is really what is in my reason. And I can build a system of this reason that I can then use to interpret and control the entirety of the world around me successfully. The world then, he argues, gets reduced to power. And power is available for the human being, the human will to use for any end it wants to. Truth is totally unmoored from any kind of ethical foundation in that. It's pure power. And this he sees in contemporary technological science, in the way in which the standards of truth as purely logical and rational and as systematic get applied to political systems and to social and economic systems that use human beings within them, and human beings themselves then get turned into human resources. They themselves, human beings, are another form of power, which can be turned on and turned off and directed and used by the person who's in control of the power. Nietzsche is not someone who overcomes this, according to Heidegger. He just takes it to its logical conclusion. He just simply says, look, where this all leads us is that there is no ultimate reality, there is no God, there is no ultimate moral standard. There is only our will and what we do with it. So Nietzsche, more than critiquing truth as it's received, he simply describes what has really happened. He lays bare what has really happened in this long history of truth. Now, Heidegger is, of course, troubled by that, not surprisingly. He comes at this from many angles, and he has many writings on truth that are, take different approaches over the course of his writings, and I'm only going to touch on a few aspects of his criticism. The first thing he says is that truth in the sense of objective correspondence of my idea to the thing out there isn't really ever, it's not really ever what truth is about in a certain fundamental sense. We don't experience objects. We experience a world in which objects already related to each other and related to us come together as a whole. There's no such thing as a direct experience of a pure object. The only way I can can experience a pure object is when it stops being useful and somehow breaks and isn't any longer in its proper relation to the rest of the world. Then I notice it because it gets in my way and it gives me pause. But as long as it's doing what it's supposed to, as long as the hammer is a hammer and it's not broken, I don't think about it. I don't try and wonder what the hammer is by itself. I pick it up and I use it. And that's as far as it goes. And what is the hammer? The hammer is this. We don't need some rational grasp of the hammer. We need to use it. We perceive it in its connection. So getting to the thing in itself, some object in itself or thing in itself, already means abstracting it and separating it from the world and from reality as we actually experience it. So truth as objectivity is, in a sense, not in touch with our real experience of reality. The second thing he says is that human beings aren't things. Human beings aren't objects. Hammer, a rock, and a tree are all things that we come across, and we have a sense of them. We use them, or we don't use them. We put them into some kind of context, but other people aren't like that. And we know that other people aren't like that. When we respond to another human being, we have an inherent awareness that they don't exist in the same way that the hammer exists, and that somehow to treat them as if they were a hammer is the wrong thing to do. Now, the problem he says here is that the traditional models of philosophical truth don't make any distinction. A real understanding of experience, an understanding of experience that really works the way experience is, that's true to experience, would have to recognize that human beings are different. Human beings make different claims on us. They have a different way of being, and we have to have a different way of relating to them. Finally, the third point here is that he says truth is, in the most basic sense, is not some product of human reason. We don't create it. It comes from a world opening up to us, where we always see things partially and for now and provisionally, and we never get beyond it if we don't engage in that and try to struggle with it and figure things out. So he's returning, in a sense, to the Greek world here. Truth is historical, it's partial. Truth is a way of life, as it was for Socrates, and even to some degree for Nietzsche, but truth is a way of life. It's a way of engaging the world. It's not something that we make, it's not something that we have. It's something that we do, in a sense, and never completely. Rethinking truth so that we focus on the limitations of reason, the differences between human beings and objects, and the way in which truth isn't something which is permanently there, eternally there, universally there, simply a thing that we can grasp, is for Heidegger a way of reclaiming our humanity, learning to live, and in addition to reclaiming our humanity, reclaiming what he calls the capacity for reverence and a kind of ethical mooring that gets lost when we focus on the power that we get from a scientific grasp of the world around us.